Hey everyone, it's Justin. Today I'm bringing to you a tutorial on a Shopify to Salesforce integration. This is going to be an introduction to an API. So what we're going to be doing in the video is we're going to show you how to pull the customer data from a Shopify store and upsert that as account data into Salesforce. To show you, we have two customers here. We have Justin Wills, which is a customer, and inside of Salesforce, we have that same information here. And you'll notice we have a custom field Shopify ID, which we're using to identify this record inside of Salesforce. So one thing to note about the integration is that we're only going to be doing this as an account inside a production environment. I've seen this done two different ways specific to Shopify. Is one, you use person accounts. So if you're just only doing B2C, then person accounts would be great for this. The other thing would be to have an account for if they don't have a company. To group your contacts under that and do it that way. I've seen both ways. It's kind of just depends on the use case really. I just want to make that note. But for this integration, for the tutorial, we're just going to be doing a simple account just because it makes it so much easier. And it's a tutorial after all. So let's jump in. So to start, let's go ahead and navigate to the Shopify store. And what we need to do is we need to expose API access. Now, the way we do that inside of Shopify is we create an app. So if I go to apps down here in the admin console, if I go to manage private apps, and if this is the first time you're doing this, you may need to accept a couple prompts, but we're just going to go ahead and create a new private app. And we'll give it a name. We'll call this Salesforce. The email doesn't matter. It should be your email. And then we need to assign permissions. So for this, we're going to actually remove the product access, and we're going to change the customer to read and write access, and that'll allow us to see the customer information. And don't worry about the webhook version or the storefront API. I'd go and save this, but I already have the app created. So let's go and navigate to that. And you can see here the private app here, and you'll be greeted with this screen, which has important information, the admin API key and the password. Now these are used to authenticate your backend to Shopify. And that's how you get this information. So this is essentially a username, and the password is a password. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at the API documentation, understand the request, and we're going to also create a sample request inside of Postman, a REST client, which will help us visualize things a little bit better. So what I have here is I have the customer API reference. So if we went to Google and just searched Shopify API, then you'd get this documentation, and we go to the customer object, and I want to go to specifically this endpoint here, the admin API version customers.json. If we go back to here, easiest ways, it's actually the first one. And what this does is this allows us to list all of the customers. And so that's great. And if we look at a response, you'll notice that it returns an object with a key of customers that's an array, and gives us information like the ID, email, first name, last name, phone number. So lots of good information here that we could pull into Salesforce. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go into Postman. Postman's my preferred REST client, but you could use any REST client. You could even do a curl request if you're really fancy or old school. Let's see. I have Postman open right here. And I'm just going to minimize that for a second. And what you'll notice in Postman is a URL that we can type in here, a method. We can send this, and then there's a couple other configuration options we have down here. So if we go back to the documentation, we'll remember that this is get. So we could choose a lot of things, but we're just going to do get as the method. And the endpoint is going to be /admin API version customers JSON. So if you look at the structure of this URL, how Shopify likes their URL structured is you have your store name. So my store name is G2 Technologies Demo .myshopify, which is just the store name URL. And make sure it's the Shopify URL and not your like custom URL if you're using that. And then our endpoint. So it's going to be the admin /API /version number /customers.json. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get the authorization header. So we're just going to do a basic auth. There's quite a few options here. All we need to do here is a basic auth where the username is the API key that we saw in our app, and then the password is the password right here. So if I go back to Postman, you can see the password here. And if we go over to headers, we can see this authorization header. This is basic. This is just the base64 encoded, which is standard in all web things. And a couple other headers that you don't need to worry about. So the other thing with specifically Shopify is Shopify works really weird with cookies. Some clients can send cookies, and the Shopify API does not like that at all. So what I recommend is if you go to cookies and clear them out before sending a request to Shopify specifically. If I go ahead and press send, pull this back up, you'll notice that I get the same object structure as the documentation, and you'll notice that I get an email for a customer named test and an email data for a customer called Justin Wills. So if I go back to my customer inside of Shopify, you'll see that I have those two customers. So that's awesome. We got the customer information. We were able to grab that from Shopify. So the next step will be to set up our Salesforce instance so we are able to import this, mutate it, and upsert it. So I'm going to go ahead and spin up a Salesforce org here. Okay, so we are back in Salesforce. I just spun up a new Salesforce instance, and we are going to do a couple of setup things before we jump into coding. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go into the remote site settings. and we're going to need to add a new remote site. What this does is this allows Salesforce to communicate with third-party sites like Shopify. This is required for any integration that you do. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a custom setting. What this will do is this allows us to store some of the information about sales or the integration outside the code, which allows us to edit this easier. A little bit of extra security, not much because it's still stored in plain text, but it's a little bit better. So I'm going to call this Shopify credentials, and we're going to create a couple custom fields here. So first one we're going to create is not the Shopify ID, is the API key, which I'm just going to do this. Going to have a length of 50. We're going to do the API secret, and that's going to have a length of 50. We are going to do the API version, which is going to have a length of 20. And we are going to do the API URL, which is going to be a length of 150. So all of these fields we're going to populate here with data. So I'm going to manage this, and for the default organization level, we're going to do new. So the API key is, if I go back to our private app, that's the API key, but I'm going to need to go in here anyway. So we need the API key here. If I can find this, we're going to need the API secret, which is going to be the password. We're going to need the API version, which is, in my case, it's, let's see, it's 2010. And we're going to need the API URL, which is going to be the HTTPS and then the G2 Technologies my demo, myshopify.com. So we're going to save that, and now we have all this information stored inside a custom setting, which is great because now we don't need to update this in the future. So very, very cool. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the object manager, and we're going to go to the account, and we're going to create a new custom field called the Shopify ID. And what this will do is this allows us to store the unique record identifier from Shopify, and we'll actually be able to upsert this if we set this field right here, external ID, which just makes working with this a lot smoother as opposed to like creating a SQL query and trying to merge the records. This doesn't need to be required, but we're going to make it unique as case insensitive. This doesn't really matter in the Shopify case because they're all numbers. Profiles doesn't matter in this case, and we're just going to save it to all the records or all the page layouts. And I guess I already created this field, so must have been a weird shop or Salesforce thing. So anyway, with that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to jump into VS Code, and we are going to start creating the requests inside of some Apex code. So let's jump right into that. Okay, so I'm in VS Code, and we're in the in a fresh org here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class. And I'm going to call it Shopify integration. So just the standard boilerplate comes here. We can delete some of this, delete the constructor method, and we are going to make a new method called get customers. This isn't going to return anything, it's static. And I'm going to go ahead and copy paste a couple of things in here and explain what's going on. So what we have here is lines 3 through 5 is we have all the objects related to creating an HTTP request. So we have the request, the HTTP request object, the HTTP response, and the HTTP object. On line 6, we have the custom setting that we call Shopify credentials. We're gonna call that as variable credentials, and the way we get that is just through a simple SOAP query. And the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna set the endpoint. So similar to Postman, we're gonna set the endpoint as this G2 Technologies demo.myshopify.com. So actually what I could do is, instead of all of this fancy stuff, I could set this as a string, but I'm not going to do that because this just makes things easier. For maintenance is having credentials in its API URL, and also being able to edit the version as well. And then we have appended the customers JSON. The next thing is we have to set the method as get. So just like we had it in Postman right here, we had a get method. So that's why we had that. We need to set the header here. And the way we do that is we have the credentials, the API key, and the API secret. Those are concatenated with a colon in between them. And then, because of the standard protocols, we need to base64 encode this. So the way we do that in Apex is we take the blob of this string right here, and we use the coding util library and base64 encode it. And that's how we get the base64 encoded authorization header. And then we simply just send the request, and we assign the response to this response object. And also what I'm going to do is I'm going to debug the body of the response here. So I'm going to save this, and we are going to looks like I forgot to authorize an org, so let's do that. Wow. Nice. Okay. Now that that's organized or authorized, let's deploy this. And you'll see it successfully ran. So I'm going to go into the developer console right here, and we're just going to run this and look at the log and see what happens. So the way we run this is we open the execute anonymous window. We would grab the class name, which is Shopify integration, and the method is get customers, and we're going to execute this. We get a success. So let's look at what happened. We look at debug, and you can see before it gets cut off, we get that customers object as a list. So great, this works exactly as expected. So the next step here would be to mutate this data into a string. or not an integer string, into an object, and then eventually end up as an account that we can upsert. So how do we do that? The easiest way is using a simple tool called JSON to Apex. If you just go ahead and search JSON to Apex, you can find it. It's json-to-apex.herokuapp.com. And how it works is you paste the JSON in here. So where we get that is just inside of Postman. We just grab this JSON right here. I'm gonna copy it and paste it in here. And then you can put a name in here. I call this Shopify customer JSON. And the other thing too is in this instance, you wanna create the explicit parse code, and I'll show you why once we try to deploy this code, and you'll see why. But I'm gonna go ahead and create Apex. And I've done this a couple times, but the easiest way to copy this is open this in a text editor, go back to your VS Code, copy the class name, and then create a class, great, and copy paste. Now, what will happen when we deploy this is we'll actually get an error, and the error has to do with a primitive value being used as a variable. So you'll see the identifier name is reserved currency. So we can see in this specific instance, it's line 43. The issue is that currency is a primitive value, so just like a string, a decimal, an object, Boolean, we can't use currency as a variable name. So instead, what we need to do is we need to change this to anything else. So I'm just gonna append _var, and then we're gonna scroll down through the explicit parser. We're gonna search for currency. Found it right here. Happens to be line, 91. So if the text is currency, then we're going to do currency var. Now, if we go ahead and deploy this, we're going to have no issues. And then I'm also going to go ahead and deploy the test class as well. So let's just go ahead and create the Apex class and copy paste the code. Make sure to change that currency var and deploy. I think another common variable that ends up getting used is time. I've seen that before with QuickBooks integration, so just you got to be aware of that, and that's the way to solve that. But so now that we have this Shopify customer JSON, we're able to parse the response body into an object. So I'm gonna copy a little bit more code here. So what I'm gonna do right here is I'm just gonna say if the response code is 200, which in this case means a success, then we're going to execute the code that we're looking for. So the way that we parse the Shopify customers is we again do the class and then the method, which is just parse, and then we pass a string, which just happens to this case be res.getBody. The next thing we're going to do is I'm just going to grab a few more lines here. Is that we want to create an account list because our end goal is to create accounts. And so just create a new list of accounts, and then we're going to loop through the customers. So you'll notice this is maybe a little bit different than what may be expected with a blind eye. The reason why is, let's look at the customer list for a second here. So the customer list is the object, and then we need to access the key customers, which makes sense if we go into our Postman. We have the object, and then we have a key customers, which is the array. And we want to iterate through the array, which is why we do that. And then each customer is not actually a Shopify customer JSON class. It's actually the subclass of that, the customer subclass. So if I go back here, we have this customers subclass. So that's actually what is being iterated through. With that, then we can start mapping data. So I'm going to create a new account. And what you'll notice is that when we upsert this, actually the account will be updated accordingly, so don't worry about that. But we're going to assign the name to be the customer first name, plus a space, plus the customer last name. The Shopify ID is going to be the string value of the customer ID. If you go back to Postman, you'll notice that this is in green instead of blue, and it's missing quotes. That's because this is actually a number. If we did not have the string value, then we would be getting a type error, so that's why I need this. We actually don't need the string value for the phone, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And we're going to add to the account list. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to upsert this. So I have a statement here which just says if the account list size is greater than 0, so if we have any records that we get, we're going to upsert the account list using the external ID Shopify ID. And if you don't have the external ID checked inside of Salesforce, then this won't work. So you must do that to use this method. And then last, to finish off this Shopify integration class, I'm going to add an else, not to this, but to this block right here. So what we're saying is that if the status code equals 200, execute as expected. Otherwise, we want to debug the status code, we want to debug the status, and maybe we would email a system admin that an error has occurred, and we would need to look into this. Maybe the credentials got outdated, maybe the version got outdated, maybe there's data that wasn't expected. A lot of things can happen. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. And we failed because there's an illegal assignment. Oh, I guess this was needed. So we'll just do that and deploy. So, okay. With that, let's go ahead and run this. Again, this if we go back to our developer console, which of course is not open anymore, classic. Just gonna go ahead and get customers and execute this. We get a success for a size of 103 kilobytes. And if we go ahead and go to sales, we will see that if we go to accounts, they're up in the recently viewed. If I go to all accounts, they're a little obfuscated, but let me go ahead and create a new list view. So I'm going to call this Shopify accounts. I can type today. And the filter is going to be that the Shopify ID is not equal to blank. So save that, and wow, we got our 2 customers, great. And if I go to details, we can see that Shopify ID, we didn't have a phone number, but we can see that information. We can see that it was created a minute ago. Obviously, you can't see the time. So that's great. So we successfully integrated data, and we pulled data from Shopify to and insert it into Salesforce. And again, if I ran this again, because we're using that upsert statement, what you'll notice is that this last modified data is going to change when I refresh it to a minute later or 2 minutes later, depending on system time. So a minute later. So great. So we're also editing the records. We're not inserting new records. If I go back to the list view, we still have 2 records. So it's great. Now, the only thing is that unless you're going to be going and running this by hand every time you want to pull the records, this isn't super useful. So what we need to do is we need to put this inside a batch class, and then that way we'll be able to schedule this so we could run nightly, hourly, or even more frequently. I'm going to show you how to do this, schedule it nightly, anyway, if we go back to VS Code, we're going to go ahead and go to the Shopify. I'm going to create a new class called Shopify Integration Batch. And I am going to copy paste the whole class and explain. So what's going on here? So we have a class, a global class called Shopify Integration Batch, and this implements a few different interfaces. This implements the database.batchable S object, and this is required for a batch class. And if you implement this interface, you'll need to implement these 3 methods right here, the start, execute, and finish. We also have the database.allow callouts. What this does is this allows us to use callouts inside of a batchable context. So it allows us to speak to Shopify inside that batch context. The final thing is we have the schedulable interface, and what this does is this allows us to schedule the batch, and we need to implement this method here, the execute, so we can do that. For the standard batch class methods, what we have here for start, we need to return a query. So because we need to get at least 1 record, I just recommend doing it like this, where you have select ID from account limit 1. That makes the most sense. So as long as you have 1 account, you'll be able to run this. The next thing we'll need to do is we'll need to implement the execute. So what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to call that method the Shopify integration.getCustomers. And the final thing we'll need to implement is the finish method. I just like to debug, like finish Shopify customer pull, so that way if I'm ever looking at the debug logs, I'm able to look and see that. As for the execute, this is pretty simple. We're going to create a new instance of the Shopify integration batch, and then we're going to use the database.execute batch on that instance. So pretty simple. And if I go to, actually we can just copy this code because that's how you'd run it if you weren't going to schedule it. And copy paste this. Go ahead and delete the spaces and execute. You notice it's very similar. We have the execute anonymous log, but we also have a couple other logs with the batch apex and the serial batch apex range handler. This is how Salesforce splits up the context. It's not too important to this, but as you can see, again, we can see that body. So if I go back into Salesforce, go to Justin, our nice little account, go to details, you can see that this was updated again at 10:33. So great. Now that we have this, if we wanted to schedule this, what we would do is we have this code here that's commented out. We have a Shopify integration batch, which similar to the just standard execute. We're going to make a string for the schedule. So this is just a cron job. This specific schedule is set to run every night at midnight. And we're going to use the system.schedule to schedule this, and we need a name, so the name is going to be Shopify customer poll. Then we're going to pass in the schedule, and then finally we're going to pass in the Shopify batch. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, I'm going to comment it back out, and if we go into the developer console, which I closed of course, then we can see a success log. And if you want to look at your scheduled jobs, if we go to setup and search for scheduled jobs, then we can see this Shopify customer poll just submitted. The next scheduled run is going to be tonight at midnight. So great. Now that we're able to schedule this, the final thing that we need to do is we just need to write a test class so we can push this to production, because if you were going to try to push this into a production instance, you would need a test class. So I'm going to call this Shopify integration batch test, and we're going to delete this, and now what we'll need to do is we'll need to put a test method. So let's just make this now is test. I'm just going to do see all data equals true. So let's do that. And then this is going to be static void test batch. Okay, so this would be the batch test that we need. Now the challenge is that we have a callout in our method, and if I go ahead and copy paste this, so we're going to create a new Shopify batch, we're going to start the test, we're going to execute the batch, we're going to stop the test, and we're going to assert that this account equals 1. We're going to go ahead and do this, or we're going to assert that the name equals Justin Wills where the Shopify ID equals 1. We're going to go ahead and do this and run this from the developer console, but what you'll notice is that we get an error. And that error is that we're unable to run callouts inside the test context. So that's an issue. There's 2 ways of working around this. One's a very kludgy way. So we can see the system.type exception right here. Methods defined as test method do not support web service callouts. So that's the error that we'd get. So there's 2 ways around this. First way is that what you can do is inside here you could say if this is there's a method to say if it's test context then do other code, or set the response as an object. I prefer not to do that. I think that's very kludgy and sloppy code. What I think is better is writing a mock test class. So we're going to show you how to do that. What we need is a private class. So let's do that. And we can nest it inside of here. So we have the private class mock, which is going to implement the HTTP callout mock interface. And we need to implement this method right here. So we're going to implement the respond method, which is going to, the parameter is going to be an HTTP request parameter, and the response, or it's going to return an HTTP response object. And so the way that I like to do these is have chain if statements. I think it's the best way to do this as opposed to making a mock callout for each URL. So what you do is you say if the request.endpoint.ends with the specific endpoint that you want to test, then we're going to set the body as a JSON, and we're going to set the status code as 200. If we didn't find the endpoint, like for whatever reason, because we didn't implement the test method, most likely, let's be honest, we're going to system.assert false for an unexpected endpoint, and then we're going to also echo the endpoint, and we'll return null because there's no response. Now, this JSON, how do we get this JSON? Now, I think the best way to do this is if we go back to the test class, you'll notice that they have a nice little string right here that's formatted so neatly. So we're going to go ahead and copy that, and we're going to paste it inside here. Not inside here. Inside here. And I'm also going to just add the static string, the static tag. That's not necessary. The other thing that I'm going to do is, because we have CL data equals true, this could actually, the way that the records are inserted, if I kept this as the ID, then we'd actually be checking against the ID that's inside of Salesforce, inside the production instance, and not the record that we just inserted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this ID 0, and I'm going to call this ID 1, and that way we can be certain that we're not going and using those test records, and we have a better understanding that we're actually testing the right data. And we're going to be asserting inside our test method that the name from the second record is Justin Wills. So that's great. The last thing we need to do to get this method working is we need to set the mock. So I'm going to just go ahead and paste that in. So the way it works is you have the test class.setMock. You're going to do the HTTP callout mock.class, which is just the class type. And then you're going to do the new mock being that class we just created inside our Shopify integration batch test. Now I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. And we can go ahead and, okay, I won't get to this static. I think final would be the right thing, but I don't care. So I'm going to deploy that. It'll deploy great, and we will go to Salesforce and open up the developer console again. And we're going to go ahead and run the test. So new run. We can just run both of these. See the results we get, and success, success. Great. So if we open the Shopify integration, 100% code coverage is what we love to see. The The test class doesn't get code coverage, but the integration batch, we'll notice, actually only gets 62%, so we're going to actually have to write another test class there. And the customer JSON gets 94, which is good enough. So we need to write one more test class to test the schedule. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to just copy paste this into here. So we're going to have one more method. It's going to be test schedule. Again, CL data equals true. We're going to need to set the mock, and we're going to go and need to create this Shopify batch. Going to create the schedule. I'm just going to create this one just because if you have the schedule as, let's see, if you had it as 0 and we already had these batch set up at midnight, then you'd actually get an error. So we need to have this different. So I'm just going to have it scheduled at 1 a.m. And we're going to go ahead and start test inside. We're going to go ahead and start test and then schedule it inside the start test stop test block. And if we go ahead and deploy this, then and rerun our test class, then you'll notice that we get 100% code coverage on this class, which means that we'll be able to deploy it to a production instance. And oh, great. Oh, it's because this is a test class. So if I just need to name this something else too. And now if I run this, we have a success and we have 100% code coverage. Great. So with that being said, that is a basic tutorial on writing an integration with Salesforce. So it's a Shopify to Salesforce integration. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please destroy the like button, as Graham Stephan says, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, as I'll be continuing to post more of this throughout the future. So thank you for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.